Welcome to Chapter 8 of Integrated Activism. This chapter is called Science in Spite of the Evidence. This chapter looks at the question of why have the social sciences deferred or not chosen to look at this whole issue of human cultural evolution and conscious cultural evolution, because it is all but invisible in the academic social sciences, or it exists at the very margins. It exists in various periods of history. You see social scientists moving in that direction and then running back away from it. We think of the sciences being progressive. Certainly the physical sciences, we can see how things have progressed from, ancient religious views through Newtonian physics, Einsteinian physics, quantum physics, on down the line. And you can see it with every realm of physical technology, or most realms. And of course, the resistance to change in the physical sciences is significant as well. I mean, Thomas Kuhn's book, I believe it's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, although I might have that slightly wrong. In any case, there's a number of similar books that have been written that, a scientist, even in the physical sciences, who has a vested interest or a long history of looking at things in a particular way, does not always embrace new discoveries. But nonetheless, in general, the physical sciences have marched forward somewhat relentlessly, and the social sciences have not. They have chosen to not look at human cultural evolution. They have chosen to not see human culture as a systematic process. They have chosen to not seek rational answers for why we behave in certain ways, collectively especially. So why is that? How does that work? Now let's look at that a bit. It is my belief, my understanding, that what happens in the social sciences is all sciences are influenced by social trends, whereas in fact, this is the only very wordy slide, I promise. All the other slides are cute pictures with some words. So in the physical sciences, they are influenced by social trends, but not necessarily dominated by social trends, and in fact put in place social trends. I mean, the computer is one very obvious mechanical technology that has had enormous social impacts. Although going back to, again, Richard Wilkinson's an understanding of technology, computers themselves came out of the increasing complexity, came out of depletion. The fact that you don't need a computer to run a sawmill to saw up wood if your culture is based on firewood and wood for building, whereas when we run out of wood, we've used it all up and we have to shift to plastics. Production of plastics is a much more complex undertaking, so we need to shift to more complex machines, including computers. So the mechanical technologies have both a push and a pull in terms of the relationship with culture. They are pushed by culture, and then they pull culture along in other directions as well. It is my understanding, my belief, having looked at the history of social sciences as much as I have, that it's all pull, that the social sciences basically have followed along, generally speaking, like obedient sheep. Now, not all social scientists are obedient sheep, and the term social scientist or social science is a very broad term, but nonetheless, the dominant trends in the social sciences are very sheep-like. They follow social trends. They do not lead them. And let's look at what that means in the United States, and this is largely true. The development of social sciences in the United States and the Western world in general are closely linked, although this particular slideshow, this particular chapter, focuses on the United States. The social sciences back in the colonial era of the United States were not organized academic social sciences. There were philosophy, religious philosophy, the classical philosophers, but there was not sociology, anthropology, psychology the way there is now. What has happened in terms of these social trends in the United States is that there has been a pivoting back and forth around class issues, class lines, between periods of social responsibility and periods of individual responsibility. So when we look at the social ills of society, poverty, even unsustainability, these various issues, but particularly poverty and injustice, the question is who's responsible? And in periods of social responsibility, society as a whole says, yeah, there are dislocations of industrial technology or of society as a whole, and it is society's obligation to try to ameliorate those dislocations, to try to help the problems caused by a mass society and help the poor. In periods of individual responsibility, there's a great deal of finger wagging, and the poor are intemperate, to use an old word, or it's kind of the variations on the welfare Cadillac theme that have gone back now for centuries. The poor are responsible for their own poverty. So we see this shifting back and forth between individual and social responsibility, and that shifting has in turn dominated the direction of the social sciences. Looking at the colonial period, it was a period of social responsibility, dominantly speaking. There were many colonial towns. They were somewhat xenophobic in some cases. They didn't necessarily welcome newcomers, but they took care of their own, generally speaking. There might be a village cow that was available, a milk cow, where the poorest person in town or people who were having bad luck could have access to the village cow. There were social relief organized through the churches, but there was a general sense of, within colonial towns, within colonial families, extended families, that people should take care of each other, and that whatever misfortune befell people, it was God's will and morally appropriate to take care of them. Now, the Victorian Age, which later became the Gilded Age, throughout the 1800s basically, by the 1820s, the United States was rapidly industrializing. We mentioned this in talking about women's rights, that women were driven back into the home and lost many of their rights in the 1820s. We also see the birth of what many people would call social Darwinism. It is more appropriately called social Spencerism, because it was Herbert Spencer, not Charles Darwin, who advocated a rather harsh approach towards the poor. But in any case, the entire Victorian era was a period of individual responsibility. There was a brief respite during the Civil War because of the dislocations of the war, where the focus shifted back to social responsibility. The early progressive era from the 1890s to World War I was a period of social responsibility, and we'll talk about why. The Roaring Twenties, the first car housing boom, was a period of individual responsibility. The Great Depression also could be called the Great Socialist Uprising, and it didn't really start as far as the change in policy until the late 1930s, although the Depression started earlier than that. The Depression, well, we could talk about the currency battle. The Depression was basically a currency battle between rich people and poor people. Who was going to control the supply of money? And the poor people won in the end, but not until about 1938. And then World War II, of course, came along and changed everything. But in any case, we can name that. The 20s bled over into the 30s, but by the late 30s, certainly we had shifted into a period of social responsibility under the New Deal. That fell apart under the Cold War, Eisenhower, and became a period of individual responsibility. The 60s were a major rollback to social responsibility, and then Reagan had yet another rollback towards individual responsibility, which has lasted until the present, with the caveat, these are broad historical trends. If the current labor movement succeeds in organizing fast food and Walmart workers, then a couple decades from now we will be able to look back at this and say this was the beginning of the period of social responsibility. But it all pivots on the labor movement, basically. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we go through here. All right, so let's look at some pretty pictures. So as I said, back in the colonial era, life was agrarian mostly, not heavily industrialized, and the general ethos, the ethical tenor of colonial society was that society as a whole should take care of poor people. That was the dominant trend. Social sciences were not organized. They were, to what extent they existed, based in classical philosophy. As the Victorian era comes together, in the 1820s in particular, Herbert Spencer and other rather vicious individual responsibility-oriented philosophers arose. Here's a Spencer quote. "If we do not like the survival of the fittest, we have only one possible alternative, and that is the survival of the unfittest. The former is the law of civilization, and the latter is the law of anti-civilization. The unfit must be eliminated as nature intended." Now that is about as stark as you can get in terms of an attitude of individual responsibility. That's basically saying the poor should starve and die, and I'm better than they are. And that was the dominant theory throughout the Victorian era. Of course, it was promulgated by the wealthy upon the poor. And the social sciences toward the late Victorian era started to become social sciences, but we're getting a little ahead of the story. There was an interruption in the Civil War, and the Civil War, of course, was a huge traumatic event for the early United States. Hundreds of thousands of American casualties, starvation in the South, severe economic deprivation even in the North. And you can't recruit soldiers with using a social Spencerist attitude. You have to have a more socially oriented or social responsibility oriented philosophy, if you want, to recruit soldiers. So periods of war are always periods of social responsibility. So that happened in the Civil War, and to a limited extent after the Civil War. There were an increase in social spending to help deal with veterans. That caved back in, and we moved from the Victorian Era became the Gilded Age. And at this point, we start to see more organization in the development of charity networks of providing social service. Instead of it being on an ad hoc or strictly on a religious or parish basis, it starts to be organized by what's called the charity societies. But they were dominated by a pretty harsh attitude of individual responsibility, even though they were in charge of administering the earliest form of organized social service in the United States. So this is a quote, I believe it's from the 1888 meeting of, yes, there it is, the date, of the Proceedings of the National Conference on Charities and Correction. Notice charities and correction. That word correction is similar to the modern correction facility when we talk about prisons. In any case, in the dispensation of public benevolence, the really helpless and unfortunate should receive primary consideration, and the able-bodied, indolent, and degraded be eliminated from their association. The evils of heredity enter largely into the consideration of all questions pertaining to the dependent and criminal classes. So you have these people coming together to give out social service and then doing it with a very social Spencerist kind of attitude. That's the way things were at that time. And the charity societies were the beginning of modern social science. Because what happened is that the modern social workers and sociologists, psychologists all grew out of the charity societies. So against the harsh edge of Victorian social Spencerist ideas was organized labor. The unions, the coal miners fought, particularly in the late 1800s, a long bloody battle to gain their rights. The anarchists, the Wobblies, travel around the country. We think of free speech. Of course, we have the right to stand up in a corner and say what we want to say if anybody's willing to listen. That wasn't true, really, in the 1800s. You would get shot, beat up, arrested, whatever. It was the anarchists who created free speech in a practical sense in the United States, or went to jail enough times that the ability to stand on a soapbox, literally and figuratively, was transformed in American culture. And of course, we have Karl Marx himself, the development of the more organized communist movements. And communists and anarchists have always been sometimes allies and sometimes bitter enemies. But the result of all of this organizing, the break point was the Depression of 1893. Between 1893 and World War I, under powerful pressure from workers and leftist movements, the U.S. Senate becomes an elected body, rural mail is established, and the newly created social sciences, they're just becoming academic social sciences in the late 1800s. You see the universities establishing departments of sociology and other, what were beginning to be what we call the modern social sciences. It is discovered in some new studies that unemployment and not moral depravity causes poverty. So that's kind of like discovering gravity or discovering air, but nonetheless, there it is. They discovered it under pressure from workers' movements. The social sciences adopted this new social responsibility attitude, and the charity societies fell apart, went away, and that whole social Spencerism got buried by the anarchists, by the Marxists, by the socialists, by the communists. And there's a profound change in the United States. The modern welfare state, the modern social services have their birth in this period. This is one of the biggest transformations of American society, for better or worse. Just the fact that the U.S. Senate, which had formerly been an appointed body, appointed by the state legislatures, became an elected body in that period. I actually don't know the exact date when that became true, but it was in that period between 1893 and World War I. World War I was a mess in a whole lot of different ways, obviously, but politically it divided the left. The American left did not know how to respond to World War I, so it kind of dissipated the left, and the United States turned towards a more conservative political attitude. This was also the first car housing boom, as I mentioned in a previous slideshow, where the cars allowed the developers to fill in between the trolley lines. You have an expansive growth of wealth, the people going out and partying in the night, the flappers, the image of the age. But what was happening in the social scientists, the newly created sociologists, social workers, and psychologists, now their professions are only a couple decades old at this point, began studying intemperance, personal inhibition, basically looking at how one's personal psychological problems caused you to be poor. So this whole focus on unemployment causing poverty was thrown out the window, and the new modern scientific thinking way to look at things was to look at how people's psychological problems cause their economic problems. Imagine that. Okay, so the 1920s lasted into the 1930s, as we mentioned. By the late 1930s, we were close to a socialist revolution in the United States. The socialist movements, socialistic movements, I guess I should say. Of course, nowadays they call Obama socialist, and that's quite silly when you look at history, because we have had real socialist movements in the United States, and by the late 1930s, they were getting very close to overturning the existing system. Maynard Keynes came along, and he's famous for this growth-based economic theory where you pay your workers more, they buy your stuff, everybody gets happy. And it works on an expanding resource base. But the political context of Keynesianism is often ignored. And his speeches are very clear. He said, my form of economic growth, it will cost you in the short term. You will have to pay your workers more, but it is the only viable alternative to the United States becoming a socialist country. And that was finally what the capitalists could hear by the late 1930s going into the 1940s. Of course, World War II came along. But with this shift, with this, the politics were quite brutal. There was actually an attempted coup against FDR, which very few people know about. It was stopped in its tracks. We came very close to electing some very powerful socialist politicians. A few of them did get into minor offices. And then we have Keynesianism and a shift towards social responsibility. Imagine that. FDR, of course, in the New Deal, he was very supportive of labor unions, and that liberalism, as we would call it in modern times, had an impact on not only the United States, but the governments that we set up after World War II in Japan and Germany in particular. Although the first few years after World War II were actually quite rough in those countries, and it wasn't a pro-labor party. The labor movements there, in fact, had to come together and demand their own rights to some extent. But in any case, over the longer trajectory, the liberalism that was established in the social responsibility period of the late 30s and World War II and the New Deal in the United States had a powerful impact on the social sciences, on our politics. Under the threat of the Cold War, Eisenhower came into office in the 1950s. The social sciences once again turned on their heels, and instead of studying the social causes of poverty, instead of looking at, there was actually some interesting development. Modern anthropology, to step back a minute into that New Deal period, anthropology began to move pretty rapidly in that period towards some cross-cultural work that set the foundation for what was later to come. Karen Horney published books about social issues affecting people's psychological health. So in each of the social sciences, there were different manifestations of the New Deal mentality towards social responsibility. Now, coming into the Cold War era, we see a dramatic shift away from that and back towards individual responsibility, particularly in the social sciences that were charged with actually administering the applied social sciences, where social science hits the pavement in social services. Only single mothers were supposed to receive welfare benefits. We're talking about the Cold War era now under Eisenhower. Newly empowered social service agencies were granted warrants to conduct midnight raids to kick in the doors of houses to see if poor families were secretly hiding husbands or boyfriends to improve their welfare eligibility. Under this campaign against, quote, welfare fraud, the applied social sciences conducted a plethora of studies about addiction, lack of future time orientation, the culture of poverty, and other individual causes that led to poverty and unemployment. So that was a period of individual responsibility, and the labor unions were pushed back a bit. Of course, the 60s were quite an explosion of cultural, political, economic change in a number of different ways. We see the growth of the hippies movement, counterculture movement as it's been called, various names, civil rights, both the militant version and the MLK Gandhian version, the growth of the women's movement. The social sciences also went through a dramatic change in the 60s. We have an explosion of pop psychology. We have educational critique from Paul Goodman to John Holt, A.S. Neal. In anthropology, you have an enormous explosion of studies looking at what could broadly be called environmental determinism, although environmental determinism is historically more closely correlated with racist anthropology. But nonetheless, this idea that humans adapt to their environment, that there is a scientific explanation for human culture, or it's possible to understand human culture in rational terms. Now, coming out of the 50s, there was a bias in the social sciences towards kind of hard science. The behaviorism of Skinner and Kohlberg, various people who were kind of wanted to make social science into something rigid and predictable. And some of these tendencies towards a broader environmental determinism or cultural materialism, to use Marvin Harris's terms, or materialism is, anyway. So the various schools of thought, and they certainly had a bias that towards making things more concrete than they perhaps deserve. But nonetheless, Marvin Harris, Esther Boserup, Richard Lee, a bunch of names of people who came along through the 60s into the 70s talking about human culture, talking about cross-cultural causality of why humans do what they do. Treatment of mental illness shifts to social support, away from medication. You see it in every realm of the social sciences. Tremendous upheaval. And again, following social trends, not leading them. Reagan came in. What happened in the 1970s was the corporate profit fell apart with inflation and energy price instability. The actual decrease in energy supply during the Arab oil embargoes was very limited, but because we were running on a tight supply at that point, the impact was enormous in terms of prices. Kicked in double-digit inflation. The corporate profit flatlined, and that left us with Ronald Reagan, who came in. Now, this is an old Union picture, but nonetheless, his biggest job was to break the back of the unions, to use the words of one of his advisors, and he did that. He very powerfully and systematically turned the unions back on their heels. Didn't destroy them completely, but had a powerful impact. So we see all of that tremendous cross-cultural, self-examining turmoil in the social sciences just kind of trickles away. And what we have in its place is the bell curve, the medicalization of mental health. So instead of social support, you have pills instead of social support for crazy people. We have the bell curve is just such a classic icon of individual responsibility. It's of course less harsh than the social Spencerism. You couldn't get away with that anymore. And then we see new sciences, sociobiology, which is not quite that new actually, but it comes to a more of a prominence in the Reagan era. Exceptionalism, behavioral economics, future discounting, discount rates, evolutionary psychology, impulsivity, neuroeconomics, postmodern, post-colonial anthropology. These are all different schools of thought. And I'm not an academic. I don't study these things in depth. But even you can see very clearly a dramatic shift towards individual responsibility following on the collapse of labor union power, basically. Workers' rights movements have driven the swing of the pendulum from individual to social responsibility. The social sciences have, by and large, followed obediently behind each generation, making the tiresome refrain that they have evolved beyond the misconceptions of the ill-informed prior generation. That's what's happened in American history. That's the reason the social sciences don't have a science of culture. It's because they have been following social trends rather than leading them. And they have, particularly in these periods of individual responsibility, fallen in line and touted the ideology of individual responsibility rather than looking at causes of human culture, because that a social science of culture is not. I suppose you could have a science of culture and still not have an ideology of social responsibility, but nonetheless, that doesn't seem to be what's happened in a practical sense. What's happened in a practical sense is, particularly in periods of individual responsibility, the whole concept of science of culture gets thrown out the window, and we get lost in the endless microcosms of academic silliness. Now, if the labor movement, the current labor movement, which is trying to organize Walmart, I said this earlier, if the Walmart workers and the fast food workers get organized, then we will look back and say this is Obama's tenure was the beginning of a period of social responsibility. I don't know if that's going to happen. It's not clear where we go from here because of the constraint of resources is going to hit us hard in the upcoming years. Constraint of organic resources is what I would predict at this point. Topsoil, clean water, stable agricultural productivity. That's what industrialism cannot fix. We can make iron and steel. In fact, the unit cost of iron and steel equipment has actually gone down in my lifetime. If you work with your hands, you know that. But what a machine, the inflation-adjusted cost of machines has gone down in my lifetime, whether it's a bicycle or a tractor or whatever you're looking at, for comparable machines going back 30, 40 years. Whereas the price of organic materials, organic-based materials, wood, food, those things has gone up. And that's going to be what industrialism can't fix, or can't fix very easily. So that's going to put pressure on the whole economy, and whether or not that tips us towards individual responsibility or social responsibility is not preordained. It's basically how organized can working class and ordinary people be, not only within the United States, but around the world. And if the lower stratas of society, or the working strata of society, are organized, then they can push forward an ideology of social responsibility, and in the process open up the social sciences. If we go back towards individual responsibility further, which that trend was put in place pretty dramatic way beginning in the Reagan era, then the social sciences will collapse, as they did in the if you look back at the late Roman Empire in particular. At the peak of the Roman Empire, the peak of their wealth, they were pro-science, although they were never as fond of it as the Greeks. But nonetheless, by the late Roman Empire, they were throwing scientists out the window. They had no interest in social sciences. So that will be our future. It will tip on what working class people are able to do in terms of organizing, and the social sciences will follow. What I would advocate, of course, is that we grab control of this whole cultural process from the bottom, create a conscious culture that has its own social science. Our survival depends on it. It's an extraordinary undertaking, but the problems that we face will never be solved until we begin that undertaking. Whether or not industrialism contracts or collapses or somehow manages to keep growing, problems will only grow until we can rationally understand the evolution of human culture and put that rational understanding to use to plan for our future. So, thank you for listening. We'll move on to the next chapter with the next slideshow. Have a good day.